The scent of cinnamon and browning butter drifted across my studio kitchen, curling into the living room where a narrow tree blinked in patient intervals. I slid a final sheet of ginger rounds onto the cooling rack outside the oven and cracked the window with my elbow. Night was arriving early the way December always teaches you. It will a slate blue hush pressing in from the coast. I had planned a quiet evening, a clean counter, a warmed mug carols low enough to behave like memory. The radio returned from commercials to a choir that sounded as if it were rehearsing 3 apartments away. The telephone rang. I dried my hands on the hem of an old dish towel and answered on the second chime. Mom, Karina's voice came crisply, each word laid out as if she had ironed it. We're keeping it intimate this year. Evan's parents, his sister's family. It's simpler that way. You understand. Her certainty moved ahead of her like a person tugging a suitcase. She had the tone people use when they are sure they are being reasonable. I pictured her standing in the new kitchen. I had not been invited to admire the quartz counters catching light, the refrigerator covered in curated magnets that said nothing true. I let the silence expand until the choir on the radio reached its rung of O. In the blank space between my ear and her breath, I could hear the script rustling. This was the place where I was meant to negotiate. The part where a mother pleads for a chair at a table she purchased with 20 years of kindness. That sounds lovely, I said, as if commenting on weather. Enjoy. A soft intake on her end confusion, skittering like static. Well, okay then. Good night, Karina. I returned the receiver to the cradle and stood with my palm resting on the cool plastic as if it were a stone in a river, something the water had decided not to move. The room was simple enough to take stock of in one slow turn, a scar on the laminate where a pot had once burned the thin fern thriving in an inherited teacup, the bag of flour by the door because I lacked another shelf. On the small table by the window, beneath the draft of damp salt air, sat a velvet pouch the color of cherry bark. It had a pleasant private weight. I pulled the drawstrings and tipped the contents into my hand. 5 keys spilled into my palm, brass heavy each cut like a small crown. They were still cool from the safe deposit box. 3 days earlier, papers had traveled through hands and screens. Initials bloomed in tidy blue on the final page, and escrow closed at 3:41 in the afternoon. The house at Gull Point belonged to me, not the biggest house on that street carved into the bluff, not the flashiest, but a place that met the ocean without apology, broad glass, pale stone, a breathing terrace. Paid in full. I had signed with a pen I'd bought at the pharmacy for 99 cents. I set the keys down and poured coffee into the cup with the hairline crack that only I could find. Steam climbed earnest and unembarrassed and brought with it a version of the past I usually stored in a high cabinet. When Stephen was alive, he never tried to lecture me about money. He collected facts the way other people collected postcards quietly for the pleasure of stacking them in order. In the 1990s, he began slipping small sums into broad market funds, the kind that never made headlines because patience doesn't headline. Later, he bought shares in a chip maker tucked into an office park in Santa Clara and a computer company whose logo was a bitten piece of fruit. He wrote the tickers on the back of grocery lists and left them by the bread box not to boast, but so he wouldn't forget what he'd already decided. We meant to learn that language together. Then the cardiologist said a sentence that broke in the middle and never managed to stand up again, and everything after that took on a hush. I left the accounts alone. I paid the bills that asked to be paid, worked the hours that asked to be worked, and did not touch the money that felt like Stephen's last completed thought. Time can be clumsy and merciless. It can also be the most faithful employee. The balances grew. Split again. The companies were no longer the jokes of hobbyists. I did nothing brilliant. I did not guess the future. I merely honored a promise I had made to a man who carried a pencil behind his ear because he liked numbers that agreed with each other. The land came later, and not through any plan of mine. My Aunt Inez left me 60 dry acres east of Anza, a rectangle of hard pan stitched with scrub, and the memory of an irrigation ditch that hadn't carried water in years. People said it was a kindness with no use. The driveway was sand. The wind forgot to stop. I visited once a season and left a sack of oranges from some other grove on the broken porch steps because it felt polite. In 2016, a meeting I didn't attend changed where the maps drew lines. Surveyors appeared in their neon vests, then trucks with drilling rigs, then men with glossy hair and cheerful binders. Inez's parcel acquired a new vocabulary. Corridor, mixed use, potential. I did the thing nobody expects of a woman who clips manufacturer coupons. I smiled and told them I was in no rush. I can wait. The desert understands patience. I let it coach me. In the spring of 2023, a number larger than my first teacher's yearly salary folded itself across the top of a contract. I moved the proceeds like chess pieces, neither fast nor slow, into instruments designed to defer taxes when you traded fields for rooms and rooms for sky. The IRS calls it a 1031 exchange. I called it the next right sentence. Throughout, I lived in the same small building where the mailboxes rattle when the neighbor on the end slams his door. I drove an old sedan with one admirable blue patch on the rear bumper. When Karina offered a check for a few things just until you get settled, I took it and then tucked the funds untouched into a separate sliver of an account labeled with the month and year. A mother's love is not made of tests. Still, sometimes the world offers you an essay question and asks what your child has learned. I let her think my quiet was emptiness. I wanted to know what she would pour into it. The cookies cooled in polite rows. I slid the trash bag free of the bin and knotted it twice. The hallway smelled like laundry and distant curry. On the landing, Yvette from 2B stopped me with the unhurried urgency of a person who doesn't like what she has to say. "Ms. Delaney," she said, tipping her phone toward me. Her manicure was festive, one nail, tiny holly, one a bell. "I thought you'd want to see this." A group thread glowed on the screen, a string of names like a tide pool of relatives and neighbors. At the top, Karina Delaney. The message beneath it read, "Mom canceled on Christmas. She wants a quiet night by herself. Please don't make it a thing." There were thumbs up and sympathetic faces, and one reply from someone I had once fed 3 Sundays in a row. "Tell her I'll drop off pie tomorrow anyway." I handed the phone back. The words did not sting where you might expect. They landed somewhere lower near the seam that holds your middle together. Erasure is not a cut, it is a rubbed a place, a thinning. "Thank you," I said. "That's kind of you to show me." "I'm sorry," she said, meaning all the things women mean when they want to return the world to fairness but cannot. I carried the trash out and watched the bag settle into the bin, the way the black plastic reshapes itself around what it is given. In the courtyard, a strand of lights on the lemon tree hissed once and steadied. The ocean 3 blocks down and 1 turn left breathed in a way you can feel if you stand still long enough. Back inside, I washed the mixing bowl and dried it with a towel that still carried a faint scent of line-dried summer. I gathered crumbs into my palm and tipped them into my mouth. Butter spiced the warmth that lingers after heat has left. On the table, the velvet pouch waited with a patience I recognized. I slipped the keys inside again, pulled the drawstrings until the fabric puckered like a closed flower, and rested my hand on it. I did not tally gains or losses. I did not rehearse speeches. I watched the steam from the cup lose its shape and disappear, and I let the room learn a new kind of quiet that owed nothing to absence. The choir on the radio arrived at a carol I knew well enough to hum without thinking. Somewhere in the building, a child laughed in 2 notes, and a parent shushed in a third. I turned off the oven, clicked the lamp to a lower setting, and stood for a moment by the open window. The night air was cool and smelled faintly of eucalyptus. On another street, someone dragged a tree stand across concrete, an ordinary scrape, a small proof that the evening was moving forward whether anyone announced it. I drew the window closed and set the latch. The keys were where I could reach them without looking. I did not touch the phone. Morning arrived like a sheet pulled smooth across a bed, quiet, decisive, without argument. I rinsed the coffee cup from the night before, slid the velvet pouch into my coat pocket, and carried a small box of cookies downstairs for the super's kids. The sedan started on the 2nd turn, a familiar shudder in the steering that felt almost companionable. I drove west until the streets began to show their backs to the water roof, stepping down toward the blue. Gull Point revealed itself the way a secret sometimes does, plainly, as if it had never been hidden. I turned into the narrow lane cut between bungalows and drought-tough gardens and stopped before a gate that opened with a quiet mechanical sigh, a greeting more than a boast. I sat with both hands on the wheel, studying the house I had only memorized from inspections and photographs. Pale stone warmed to a color like bread crust. Glass that refused to treat the ocean as decoration and instead treated it as an equal. A terrace that didn't stick out its chin but held itself ready like a stage patient for its players. When I stepped from the car, the air carried salt and the faint eucalyptus sweetness that rides along this part of the coast. The keys in the pouch touched each other with a sound like coins and promises. Inside booties and drop cloths waited in a neat stack, and a canvas bag sat by the door with a handwritten note. "Ms. Delaney, welcome home. Maya." She emerged from the great room, all shoulders and swift steps, a tape measure looped like jewelry, a pencil tucked into close curls. "We're right on time," she said, scanning the ceiling lines the way other people read weather. "Tree goes there." She pointed to the place where the beams lifted into an apex and the room gathered itself. 12 feet, nothing taller. I've got a ladder coming and lights we can dim by zone. Terrace can seat 30 easily with the sea rail clear. We'll float the console behind the head table so your sightlines to the water never break. She led me out through the sliders. The terrace wore the morning like a shawl, gulls hanging in a pale sky, the line of the horizon stitched clean, as if someone had taken a ruler to it. "If we keep the table shallow," Maya went on, "people will lean in." "You want that. The trick is to avoid banquet sprawl." She grinned at me. "If you're still all right with candlelight, I'll call my guy for hurricane chimneys. Nothing fussy, clear glass. The ocean does the rest. Candlelight." I said, already picturing the small choreography of hands in flame. Maya moved through the rooms with an inventory that was half orchestration and half prayer electricians to adjust the dimmers runners to string greenery, someone to polish the new brass pulls because installers always touch them with drywall dust. When she left me with a quick squeeze of my forearm and a promise to return after lunch, I stood alone in the great room and let the sound of the sea arrive through the glass. It was not loud. It was insistent in the way a steady heart is. I opened my phone then, not to scroll, to place calls. "Rosa," I said, when the line clicked alive. We had not spoken out loud in a year, not since the afternoon when she stood in front of a thrift store mirror and let me pin a hem while she told me she and her brother were selling the house. "I'm making dinner tonight. Christmas Eve. I would like you to be here." For a second, I could hear Sacramento traffic, the fluttered breath of a bus air brake, the metallic cough of a shopping cart someone shoved too hard. "Nora." Her voice moved through disbelief toward joy as surely as a person crossing a room. After last year, I thought, well, yes, I'll come. I'll drive down. I can leave in an hour. "Come as you are," I said. "There will be a bed." I called Marco at this garage next. The line clattered with the knuckled rhythm of a socket wrench and a radio band country song insisting the world could be simple if you wanted it enough. He laughed when I said my name. "Cousin," he said, and the word held the weight of summers and sticky hands and bicycle grease on knees. "I heard you were lying low." "I'm setting a table," I told him. "Bring that appetite your mother pretended to scold." "Should I wear the Santa tie?" "If you must." I called Mrs. Kim, who had organized sign-up sheets at church since before the hymnals were reprinted. I called the Felds from the old building. People Karina had edged out of group threads, one careful omission at a time, as if erasure were housekeeping. I called Lila Hart, whose nonprofit taught teenagers to bow the first clean note out of a scratched violin and to hold it as if it were a kind of promise. "They'll play on your terrace," she said. "They'll remember that as long as they remember anything." "Let them eat with us too," I said. "No one stands outside a door in the cold tonight." By noon, yeses stacked in my messages like plates. Maya returned with a florist whose van held eucalyptus bay and lengths of winter jasmine that smelled like a memory of June. A rental crew rolled in round tables and light folding chairs and a bar that unfolded from a crate like a trick. The caterer arrived, last two women with clipboards and calm. They carried coolers that released a fog of cold when they opened local halibut bright-eyed and clean, baskets of spot prawns, crates of oranges from an inland grower who still wrote invoices by hand. A baker delivered loaves that cracked when you pressed them and a sheet cake the cheerful size of good luck. I signed where they pointed, feeling the odd gladness of paying for craft done well. The house transformed the way people do when they are finally seen in the light they were built for. Maya's crew buckled garlands to the banister and tucked sprigs of bay into the mantel, letting the green rim the pale stone without smothering it. She set pots of paper whites that would open later in the evening and fill the air with that particular clean scent that always seems like the color white. She placed bowls of clementines along the console because bright is a kind of hospitality. I carried a box upstairs to the bedroom and set it on the bench, a dress as old as the decade after Stephen died, black and plain, a pair of low shoes. In the top drawer of the nightstand, wrapped in tissue that had grown soft with refolding, lay an opal pendant in a setting gone buttery with wear. My grandmother had worn it to a courthouse wedding and to the grocery store with equal sincerity. I lifted it by its chain, felt the small cool against my palm, and fastened it at my throat. The stone caught a slip of daylight and made its own weather. The phone buzzed, Yvette's name on the screen. "Saw this, and thought you should know." She forwarded a screenshot from a group thread that used to include me and now did not. Karina at the top. The message read, "We're doing family only this year. Mom's fine with a quiet movie night. She prefers it. Please don't push it or she'll spiral." There were sympathetic replies. One, "We'll send something over so she knows we care." Another, "Maybe next year when things are calmer." I let the heat rise and then settle the way you do when the pot threatens to boil and you lower the flame. I typed "Thank you" to Yvette and put the phone face down on the nightstand beside a small bottle of lotion from a hotel I had once thought too nice to use. I touched the opal again and returned downstairs. By late afternoon, the terrace had begun to believe in itself. The tables wore white cloths and water glasses that threw small squares of light onto the stone. The ocean shifted its blue from unreadable to generous. An Amtrak horn floated up the bluff and then slid away, leaving the faint rattle of a train moving forward, somewhere below the edge of what we could see. The teenagers arrived in pairs with instrument cases shy in the way of children whose talent has made them visible before they're ready. Lila collected them with a conductor's cheerfulness and set them to tuning in the corner near the planters. Marco came carrying a bottle of something sparkling and a pan of roasted peppers he insisted had to be eaten immediately. Rosa called from the road to say she could see the water now that the traffic had unfolded like a fist unclenching. People who had not gathered in the same place for years arrived and shook hands over old jokes, as if picking up a conversation left on a table. Mrs. Kim tucked folded napkins under her arm and began smoothing what did not need smoothing because some women never stop setting the world right. Chairs scraped, voices warmed. A wind lifted and slipped under the tablecloths, and the room with no walls, grew a center. When the light went low enough to color faces, a soft apricot, the youth ensemble began with a carol so spare you could have balanced a glass on it. Their bows found the line, and people unconsciously leaned forward the way you make space for what you love. I stood for a moment in the doorway and noticed the frame of it mirrored in the glass, my own reflection caught mid-breath. I lifted my phone, stepped back 2 paces, and took a wide photo that held the tree, the tables, the small human geometry of shoulders turned toward one another, and the ocean beyond pretending to be still. I captioned it "Dinner with the ones who showed up." The post began to collect responses almost immediately. Hearts from people who had gone missing into new jobs in distant cities, comments from cousins who remembered a potluck in a church basement 10 Christmases ago, and wrote as if they were still scraping plates into the same bin. Someone I had not seen since Stephen's memorial wrote, "I'm glad you're surrounded tonight." The screen soft glowed, then vibrated against my palm, Karina calling. I let it pass to voicemail, and another call rose beneath it, and another. I set the phone on the console face down. The caterer's crew moved like practiced ghosts, laying platters of halibut that had surrendered to heat, just enough bowls of fennel and citrus salad, bright as if someone had squeezed a small sun into them, baguettes arranged to suggest abundance without waste. Marco clinked his fork to the side of his glass. "To my cousin Nora," he said, standing with one hand braced on the table and the other lifted because he never had learned to speak without his hands. "Who kept every birthday in her head, who can fix a cabinet hinge with a butter knife, and who reminds us that a table is not a place, it's a verb." Laughter answered him, and then the quiet you need for a toast. Rosa stood next and didn't stand so much as unfold. She looked at me and then at the water. "When we were girls," she said, "we used to walk census-deep streets after dinner and count porch lights. We decided the more lights we saw, the safer the world was. This," she gestured to the terrace, "is a lot of lights." Lila kept the teenagers to a murmur behind the toasts and then let them loose into a melody that recognized itself. People passed plates and made space, and refilled each other's glasses. It was not a spectacle, it was a relief. And in that relief, something like steadiness took the empty chair inside me and sat down. I felt the phone again before I heard it. A vibration translating insistence into touch. When I flipped it over, there were 2 voicemails from Karina Short, and clipped the cadence of a person who expects to be answered and is not. The 3rd message came from a number I didn't have saved. A small voice filled the tiny speaker, bright and careful, the way children muster themselves when they address a machine. "Grandma, it's Milo. Are you watching the fireworks on TV? We usually watch them together. I'm wearing the socks you gave me with the tiny buses." "Okay. Bye." I held the phone against my sternum. Something in me ached in a way that did not ask for permission. I returned to the table. The teenagers finished a piece that ended on a note you could have mistaken for a held breath. Mrs. Kim laughed so hard at something Marco said that she had to touch her napkin to the corners of her eyes. I caught Lila's gaze and lifted my glass, and she lifted hers back, and that small exchange felt like the hinge in a door doing its job. I stood when the ebb between courses offered space and let the conversation thin into listening. "Friends," I said without reaching for anything that insisted on being wise. "I'm grateful you came. The food tastes better because you're here. The room is warmer because you are in it." I lifted my glass higher. Let's keep the table set with respect. No one applauded. They lifted their glasses as if we had agreed on something simple that did not need selling. The youth ensemble slid into a tune people could hum without knowing they knew it. Rosie from the florist adjusted a sprig at the edge of the mantel because she could not help herself. I sat. The halibut arrived. The candles took on the particular fervor they assume after their first hour a confidence of flame. The screen lit again and again with calls I did not take the names stacking until the phone tranced with its own insistence nudged itself slightly across the wood. A server rescued it with 2 fingers and returned it to the console. I slipped it into my purse and set the purse under my chair. A wind brushed the terrace from the west enough to lift the corners of the runners and to carry a strand of violin across the stone as if it had weight. Somewhere below, a buoy bell made its single patient sound. Dessert plates migrated into view, sugared edges catching candlelight, and someone at the end of the table began to sing a verse that made people grin and join in only halfway because everyone pretends not to know the words to the songs they've always known. Headlights threw a long pail across the driveway beyond the gate. There was the sound of gravel soft moving under tires, and then the hush that follows when an engine cuts and leaves the air to itself. A door shut, and then another. Conversation stuttered, and then found a path around the interruption the way water does around a stone. I placed my napkin on the table and rose. The opal at my throat was cool. I crossed to the threshold where the room ends, and the rest of the house begins, and walked toward the foyer. The chandelier sent small shards of light to the floor, as if it had decided to add its own small brightness to the night. I did not rush. I did not slow. I walked until the wood under my shoes changed to stone, and the sound changed with it, and then I reached for the door. The foyer held the night in its glass the way a lantern holds a flame. I opened the door. Karina stood on the top step with her chin lifted, as if the air were thinner up there. Evan hovered half a pace behind his hand in his coat pocket, his eyes traveling the archways like someone counting exits. "You've been ignoring our calls," Karina said. The words came out polished and sharp, like a spoon someone had honed to a point. "I've been hosting my guests," I said. The sound of conversation from the terrace slid down the hall and pooled by the threshold bowed strings, a laugh, the soft click of a glass set gently on wood. Karina's gaze cut past me, registering the low light. The greenery braided along the banister, the glimpse of white tablecloth like a shoreline somewhere deeper in the house. "So this is where you disappeared to." "I didn't disappear," I said. "I opened the door you didn't knock on." A muscle in Evan's jaw moved once. "We need to talk," he said, then looked at Karina as if borrowing the permission to have said it. I stepped aside and let them enter. The chandelier sent small facets of light onto the marble in the pattern of a scattered handful. I closed the door on the night and led them toward the study where a leather folio waited on the desk, like a quiet sentence that did not need italics. "Here," I said, "we'll have privacy." Karina took 2 slow steps into the room, set her handbag on the chair as if reserving it, and turned. "Mom." If you wanted to be with us tonight, you could have said so instead of—" She gestured vaguely toward the rest of the house as if it were a costume. "I did say so," I answered. "For years. I said yes to every invitation until I stopped being invited. I said yes to birthdays where I was placed at the far end with the kids in the coats. I said yes to being told the casserole was sweet while the caterer set the real food in another room. That's not fair," she said quickly, but she didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at the grain of the desk. "I brought a sweater from Milo last December," I said. "Blue with school buses on the cuffs. I watched you lift the cuff and frown because the buses didn't have a brand name." Evan's hand left his pocket and found the edge of the leather blotter. He began and then stopped. "It got complicated. I repeated, not as a challenge, merely to try the word out loud. "All right." I opened the folio and slid a crisp page toward them. The paper made a sound like a door closing only because someone had finally fitted into its latch. My name stared back in black type, where the space for an owner leaves room for only one truth. Property address, parcel number, consideration received. Karina didn't reach for it. She stared. "What is this?" "The deed," I said. "To this house. Gull Point. Purchased outright under my name. You know the bank branch downtown where Mrs. Kim still insists on paper receipts because she trusts the weight of them. Their notary stamped it yesterday." Her eyes moved over the lines and then back up to me. "How patiently," I said. "And legally. Aunt Inez's acres near Anza became this view. The accounts your stepfather started kept their promises." I waited and listened. I read what Stephen left me to read, and when the time came, I did the arithmetic the statutes required and signed my name where it asked to be signed. "You let me think." She didn't finish the sentence. She let it hang in the air and color itself. "You should have told me." "I did tell you," I said. "In the way I live. In the way I kept showing up with something that tasted like a real dish. In the way I defended you when silence would have been easier. I told you by standing at your sink doing the pans while you hosted. I told you by not making a scene. That's not telling," she said. Color flooded her face, and when she flushed, she looked younger in a way that made me want to touch her hair. "You let us think you needed help. You offered help. I took it. I put it aside," I said. "I wanted to see what you would do when you believed the floor under me was thin." Evan found a chair but didn't sit. He balanced his fingers on the back of it like a man trying to look casual at a railing on a moving deck. "Karina's parents?" "My parents," he corrected. Glancing at me, "They have their expectations. It's not just you. It's the table, the wine, the clothes. It's a lot. We've been trying to—" He looked for a word that wouldn't bruise when he said it. "Fit. And to fit you rubbed away what didn't match," I said. "You sanded down the parts of me that embarrassed you. You didn't argue with the RSVP you wrote on my behalf to your own friends. You pulled me out of threads and told people I canceled. You said I preferred quiet. You wrote spiral when you meant inconvenient." Karina inhaled. "I never said you were inconvenient. You typed it," I said, to Yvette. "To the neighbors who used to come for roast chicken when the power went out in our building and we gathered candles on pie tins. You told them I'd be alone by choice." Her mouth opened then closed. She looked at Evan as if asking him to supply an alternate memory. He rubbed the bridge of his nose and did not speak. I slid the folio slightly so the edge of the deed aligned with the edge of the desk. "You came here," I said in a hurry, "not because you missed me, because the photographs told you a story you didn't write." Karina's eyes flashed. "You posted that on purpose." I posted a table with the people who showed up. No one was named, no one was shamed. The ocean was doing half the work and needed no credit. She looked beyond me to the window. The terrace's light softened the night into something you could touch. I could feel the shift in her, the small collapse of a scaffolding you didn't know you were standing on until it trembled. "I was trying to make it simpler," she said. "With Evan's family, they inspect everything. If you came in those dresses, if you brought—" She gestured with both hands, helpless and precise at the same time. "I didn't want them to think less of me through you." "That is the point," I said. My voice didn't rise. It arrived. "I am not a frosted window you look through to see yourself. I am the person who raised you. If their eyes measured that as theirs to own, it was never mine to fix." Silence invited itself into the room and took a seat. Behind us, a bow found the first pure note of the next piece, and the sound slid down the hall thin as silk. "What do you want?" Evan asked. The question fell out of him surprised, as if he had meant to ask something else, and discovered the honest one first. "I want to eat my dinner in my house with people who speak to me as if I am present," I said. "I want to allow the evening to stay intact. And I want the two of you to stop pretending that a polite cruelty is not cruelty." Karina's posture changed the way a posture changes when a person is no longer performing stand and fight, but trying to keep from falling apart. "So that's it. You built this." She looked again toward the terrace, toward the white cloth and the hush of candles, and left us out. "You left me out," I said. I noticed. She blinked. Evan finally sat heavily, as if the chair had negotiated a truce with him. I took another document from the folio and placed it beside the deed. "Here is what happens if you want to come through that door as family again," I said. "These are not threats. These are the rules of this house." Karina stared at the page as if reading somewhere very far away. "What rules?" "The first is simple," I said. "Respect is the ticket of entry. Not the kind you perform when others are watching. The kind that sounds like please and thank you, and looks like a chair pulled out as if the person sitting in it matters." "That's not a rule," she said reflexively. "That's manners." "Yes," I said. "And when they're genuine, they are a way of telling the truth." I tapped the paper. "Second, you will schedule counseling. Both of you. I will attend the first session. Not to corner you, to hear you, to let a third pair of eyes keep the room square." Evan's mouth moved but didn't settle on words. "Third, I said for a month you will ask nothing of me. No favors, no errands, no money. You will bring only actions. If you think something kind about me, you will say it out loud where a third person can hear it. If you cannot manage that, you will say nothing." Karina swallowed. "And the fourth," her tone had more strength in it than I expected. I was glad to hear it. "The fourth is public," I said. "You will write to the people you told that I canceled, and you will correct the record. You will not blame miscommunication. You will say you misstated. You will say you are sorry you removed me without asking me if I wanted to be removed. That will humiliate me," she said, quiet. "It will correct you," I said. "Those are not the same injury." Her eyes shone. She blinked hard. "You've been planning this for weeks." "I've been living with you for years," I said. "This is what living produced." Evan leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands tented briefly, like a man praying without addressing anyone in particular. "And if we agree?" "Then you come to my table." "Another night," I said. "Not this one. This one is full." He nodded once acceptance with nothing clever appended. "And Milo," he asked, his voice changing shape when he said the name. "He keeps asking if he'll see you soon." "Milo," I said, and the ache from the voicemail returned in a way that didn't fracture me. "I love him. That does not change. But his presence in my house will not be a lever you use to move me." Karina's face folded in on itself and then carefully unfolded. "He left you a message," she said, surprising herself by mentioning something I already knew. "He thinks of you when he sees buses." "I know," I said. I placed the last document on the desk, a draft written in the plain language lawyers prefer when they are tired of decorative thorns. "This is a trust," I said. "It concerns what happens if I am not here to set the table myself. It is not a promise or a threat. It is a description of how the money attached to my name behaves." Karina stared unmoving. "Milo's share vests if he grows into a person who gives," I said. "Not perfectly. Not performatively. Measurably. Hours at a food pantry. Tutoring hours for kids who need them. A record of kindness you can't fake because the person at the other end can name it. If he chooses to become the sort of man who throws his weight around and leaves smaller people bruised, the money will not reward him for it." "That's extreme," Evan said softly. "It's a boundary," I said. "The money was built on patience. It will live there too." Karina's eyes dropped to her hands and stayed. When she raised them, something in her face had changed less lacquer, more skin. "I told Aunt Mara you canceled," she said. "I told the Kims Mrs. Kim and her daughters. I told Lila. I told the Felds. I said you needed rest and that any pressure would be bad for you." Her voice broke on the word bad, as if it had caught on the edge of a memory. "I thought I was smoothing things. I didn't want anyone to see that you don't fit the rooms I keep trying to enter." "I fit the rooms I build," I said. The chandelier flickered once, then steadied a small tremor in the line. The house took a breath. Out on the terrace, laughter gathered and then emptied into air like the tide's gentle thievery. "You can stay and eat," I said, hearing, even as I spoke, that I was not changing the evening's shape, only naming its edges. "At the small table in the breakfast alcove off the kitchen. If you choose that you will sit, you will say please, and you will leave your criticism at the gate." Karina looked toward Evan, who had dropped his gaze to the polished floor, as if the answers were embedded there. She shook her head. "Not tonight," she said. "The refusal didn't carry a blade, it carried fatigue." "I'm not dressed for this room. No one is dressed for this room," I said. "The room dresses itself." Evan stood. "We'll go," he said simply. I gathered the papers into the folio and closed at the leather, sighing in a way that felt like the book accepting its own weight. "Before you do," I said, "there's one more name the apology must reach." Karina's eyes lifted. They were her father's eyes when they were tired and trying not to show it. "Whose?" "Mine," I said. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Karina nodded once, as if measuring the size of a word she had used in sentences without tasting it. "I'm sorry," she said, and the apology made no excuses for itself. "I'm sorry I erased you. I'm sorry I made you small in rooms you helped build. I'm sorry I wrote spiral when I meant inconvenient." I let the words land. They arrived without ornament, and so carried their own gravity. Evan cleared his throat. "I should have said something," he said. "At dinner. In the texts. When I heard you were taking a quiet year. I should have said you hadn't said that." "Yes," I said. "You should have." He didn't defend himself. The omission held its shape and didn't need my help naming it. "Then we'll do the sessions," Karina said almost to herself. "We'll write. We'll keep our asks to ourselves. We'll show it." "Good," I said. The study felt larger when the words were in the room instead of outside it. The chandelier steadied to the low hum a fixture makes when it finds its current. I walked them to the foyer. At the door, Karina paused and turned as if to say something else, decided not to, and instead reached without looking to touch the opal at my throat, the barest brush of a fingertip to make sure it was real. Her face flickered with some memory that belonged only to her, perhaps the day I folded that pendant into tissue and told her the story about a courthouse dress and a grocery list. "Good night," I said. "Good night," she answered. They stepped into the cool air, their shadows tilting toward the hedge. Gravel sighed under their shoes. The gate swung back to itself with the kind of efficiency that does not need applause. I closed the door and stood for a moment with my hand on the brass, the metal taking my warmth and keeping it. The house did not wait for me to command it. The strings on the terrace rose again, and a run of laughter chased itself to the edge of the glass and dissolved. I walked back down the hall toward the light that had been waiting the whole time, and toward the long table that was exactly as long as it needed to be. The hall returned me to the music, as if it had been holding my place. The youth ensemble slid into something bright and quick, the kind of tune that makes spoons want to keep time. Chairs eased back and conversations breathed again. A gust stitched the candle flames to steadier lengths. I took my seat. No one asked where I'd been. People who trust a room don't interrogate its host. Marco pressed a sugared orange wedge into my hand with the solemnity of a prescription. Mrs. Kim patted my forearm twice, then reached for the bread as if the sequence itself were a blessing she'd rehearsed all her life. Plates cleared, new plates appeared. The cake's first cut showed a pale, even crumb. Lila's students, bolder now, traded melody and harmony without stepping on each other's toes. The ocean darkened to that ink blue that remembers every color it swallowed all day. I caught Rosa's eye and tilted my head toward the terrace edge. She nodded and lifted her glass. Two of the teenagers startled when a gull cried, then laughed at themselves and kept playing. The house did what it had been designed to do. It gathered and held. There was nothing grand to narrate, only the exact right angle of a chair, the true pitch of a joke told in the proper order, the soft scrape of a platter returning empty. When at last the ensemble packed their cases, and the last guests folded into coats, the terrace cooled to a shine. I stood by the open sliders for a minute longer than necessary, letting the night rinse the noise from my ears. The gate latched itself with a small, confident click. Inside, I stacked plates, lifted glasses gently into a crate, and ran hot water until the steam rose. Maya's crew had already ghosted through setting the rooms back to their baseline greens, breathing along the mantel. Paper White's not yet open candle stubs neatly gathered on a tray, as if they too had been guests. I washed until the last 2 wine glasses looked at each other without streaks, then turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. In the mirror, the opal had settled into the hollow at my throat, as if the day had carved that place for it, and then stepped aside. Morning arrived in a clean line. Fog had walked in from the water and folded itself in the cove, leaving the path on the bluff almost to ourselves. I put my hands into my coat pockets, found nothing but the velvet pouch and a tissue packet, and followed the curve north until the trail leaned out over the rocks. Pelicans skimmed the surface in a measured V, wingtips grazing the water like signatures. The smell of salt and eucalyptus braided itself thinner and thinner until all that was left was cold air and the quiet engines of the sea. Back at the house, I took coffee in the study. The windows framed the water as if someone had drawn 3 careful rectangles around a living thing and asked it to pose. On the desk lay a folder I'd set aside weeks ago and hadn't brought into the light until now, a short charter 3 pages only for a supper that would repeat itself on the last Friday of each month. We call it the neighbor's table. Elders first, but not only. Musicians welcome if they brought their own music stands. No one turned away for lack of shoes that matched. I read the lines as if they belonged to someone else, and then wrote my name the way a person writes when the letters understand where they're going. I sealed 2 envelopes, one for the church office, one for Lila's nonprofit, and set them on the corner of the blotter where outgoing things wait for the world. Then, because there's a rightness in resetting a thing you filled, I walked to the terrace and unmade the long table, cloths folded, chairs pushed in, knives and forks counted and returned to their tray. I straightened a sprig of bay that had angled itself toward the room and stepped back. The stone looked newly washed, though I had done nothing but put objects back where they said they belonged. I lifted my phone for a last photograph, not to collect approval, but to fix the image where my hands could find it later. The frame held the cleared table, the sea carrying on with its appointment, and a slim reflection of a woman in a dark sweater who looked like someone I recognized and hadn't greeted properly in a while. I typed a caption and pressed send. My house, my rules, my family chosen and earned. 2 messages arrived while the photo was still locating itself among other people's mornings. The first was a screenshot from Karina, an appointment confirmation with a therapist's name I knew by reputation because she listened more than she arranged. Next Wednesday, 3 p.m., the text beneath it read, "Will be on time. No apology attached, no ribbon." The earlier words in the study had already done their work. I let the breath I'd been holding uncurl. The second message was a picture message that took its time to open, as if the phone wanted me to prepare. A sheet of printer paper filled the screen. Crayon blue for the horizontal line that meant ocean. A house perched above it, with an exaggerated terrace square windows beaming yellow, and a stick figure woman with 3 careful loops for hair standing beside a round table. Above the roof, block letters bending over themselves, Grandma's house by the water. A smaller stick figure stood near the door wearing socks scribbled with tiny rectangles that I understood were buses. From Milo, the caption printed in an adult hand in the corner. I looked up from the screen and back out to the real terrace. The fog had thinned. A gull took the air with a sound like fabric teased loose from a nail. I placed the phone beside the envelopes and pressed my thumb against the corner of each to make sure the edges met cleanly. The house made one of its settling noises, the pipes, or the framing a small interior shift that never asked for attention and so always received it. I walked the rooms once, not to inspect, but to greet the mantel, the stairs, the rectangle of shadow where the tree would stand later today, after the florist delivered it. The breakfast alcove off the kitchen that brightened even without sun. In the coat closet, a faint trace of last night's citrus held on. I stood with the door open and let it find me. When I reached the foyer again, the brass at the front door was cool. My hand remembered the exact pressure it took to pull the latch without a sound. Beyond the glass, the hedges were still beaded from fog, and the street beyond the gate kept its own private errands. I didn't touch the knob. I didn't need to. The house understood its job. The sea kept its. I went back to the study and sat the opal, a small winter moon, at the base of my throat. The pen lay where I'd left it, and the signatures, 2 of them, had dried to a quiet sheen. I placed the envelopes into the outgoing tray. Then I slid the velvet pouch closer, loosened its mouth, and let the keys rest against my palm for a moment. Heavy Ordinary answered. "Thank you so much for listening to today's story." If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.